The winter wind, cold as shattered glass, swept across the lonely city streets, flinging itself with a bitter howl against window panes and forcing even the most determined of wanderers to seek shelter. High above, a heavy sky threatened fresh snowfall. Under that sky, in a modest house at the edge of Everfall's dilapidated district, Ethan Cole stood in his small kitchen, glancing out at the swirling snow through frosted glass. He listened to the soft hum of the food heater. The old device sputtered and wheezed, as though it, too, felt the weight of the biting night. Ethan, nearing 40, with deep brown hair shot through with streaks of silver at the temples, carried the weariness of a man who had long ago lost both his faith in the future and his faith in himself. The lines around his eyes whispered of silent sorrows, and his measured motions spoke of a man who had made peace with loneliness, if not by choice, then by necessity. The city had changed since the war's end, and even though the fighting had subsided, a solemn hush remained. Many folks locked their doors tighter than ever, suspicious of those different from themselves, frightened of the unknown that lurked beyond the battered walls. He had never asked for much, Ethan Cole. Once, he had dreamed of traveling the star lanes, forging alliances, seeking wonders on distant worlds. But he had remained here, an anchor to a city battered by too many storms. He lived on the outskirts in a dimly lit neighborhood where stray beams of lamplight cast shaky shadows across battered porches. If ever the city was alive once, it now seemed a hollow reflection, with abandoned shops, boarded-up houses, and empty sidewalks coated by perpetual drifts of snow. As the heater chimed to signal his dinner was ready, Ethan sighed, reaching out to open it. Just then, 3 sharp knocks echoed through the house, slicing through the hush, making his heart leap. He froze. No one had knocked at his door in ages. Another round of insistent taps followed, rapping swiftly on the wood, fainter than the first yet filled with desperate urgency. Fear flickered in his chest, not from danger alone, but from the startling knowledge that someone was indeed out there, braving the blizzard, needing something in the dead of night. Swallowing hard, Ethan stepped away from his neglected meal and made for the door, each step echoing on the scuffed wooden floor. His hand hovered over the latch, trembling. The wind moaned, and for an instant, he considered leaving the stranger outside. That was what most would do. Turn away, not invite trouble. But some half-forgotten sense of decency spurred him onward. He unlatched the bolt and opened the door. The sight that met his eyes was astonishing. A woman, tall and slender, draped in a threadbare cloak, stood shivering on his snow-laden porch, and in her arms, she clutched a bundled infant. The woman's skin was faintly dusky, like a deep twilight blue, and her eyes, luminous and golden, glowed with an otherworldly radiance. She was one of the Volari, an alien refugee from the war that had ravaged not just Earth's alliances, but entire star systems. And she was not alone, for in her trembling arms lay a child of the same hue, dusky skin that shimmered under the faint porch light. The baby's tiny face, mostly obscured by makeshift wrappings, revealed large, liquid eyes that glowed a brighter gold than the mother's, flickering with confusion and primal fear. For a long moment, Ethan and the woman stared at each other, the wind flinging shards of snow against them like little knives. The baby emitted a soft whimper. "Please," the woman breathed at last. Her voice trembled not merely from cold, but from exhaustion, from heartbreak. She nearly collapsed, knees buckling, threatening to pitch forward onto the porch. Instinctively, Ethan reached out, steadying her by the arm, feeling how thin she was, how frail. Up close, he saw shadows beneath her eyes, the hollow pallor of someone who had gone too long without proper nourishment. "Come in," he said quickly, not letting himself think any further. He gathered the baby in a gentle cradle, feeling the child's slight weight, stunned by how light and helpless it was. The mother, eyes wide with both relief and trepidation, stepped cautiously over the threshold. The door closed behind them, sealing out the storm, but not the tension that clung to the air between them. Inside, in the warmth of his modest home, Ethan hurriedly motioned toward the living room, where an old couch, worn to the threads, offered a place to sit. He set the child there, carefully, and helped the mother lower herself to the cushions. She looked around, wariness mingling with something akin to hope. Perhaps she was accustomed to far harsher receptions. Doors slammed in her face, authorities summoned. Ethan could see in her eyes an unspoken question. Why was he helping her? Uncertain how to begin, Ethan fetched a blanket from a small trunk near the fireplace, then wrapped it around her shoulders. He was not a wealthy man. His possessions were limited, but warmth, at least, he could offer. A flicker of gratitude crossed the woman's features, though her eyes never left the child. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice holding the lilting accent of the Valari, a delicate roll on the final syllables. Ethan crouched near her. I can make some food, if you need it," he offered. "I only have simple rations, but it's warm." She nodded, and he went to the kitchen with hurried steps, rummaging through cupboards. The hum of the heater was still present, and his own meal, forgotten, had gone cold. He scowled at the half-burnt dish and pulled out fresh supplies. Within minutes, the aroma of simmering broth filled the air, making the mother turn her face toward the kitchen, drawn by the promise of sustenance. The infant stirred, letting out a thin, plaintive cry. She rocked the child, murmuring softly in her native tongue, a string of soothing notes that made Ethan's chest tighten. There was so much desperation in her every motion, so much sorrow in the way her eyes flicked about the room, as though she expected him at any moment to cast her out. When the food was ready, Ethan offered her a bowl, which she took and began to eat with trembling hands, as though every spoonful was a gift beyond measure. He could hardly tear his gaze away, struck by how starved she must have been. Soon, her cheeks regained a hint of color, and the child, noticing that warmth had returned, quieted a fraction. Eventually, she spoke, setting the empty bowl aside. "My name is Sira," she said in a hushed voice. "I come from the Valari outpost. It was destroyed. We were told to flee. So many of us had to scatter. The city, it isn't safe anymore." Her words trailed off, tears threatening to spill from her golden eyes. The baby wriggled, as though sensing her mother's distress, letting out a small whimper that tugged at Ethan's heart. "I'm Ethan," he replied, voice gentle. "You're safe here, for as long as you need. Let me at least help you through the night." She nodded, though her gaze fell. She had likely heard similar promises from others, only to be betrayed or cast out once authorities knocked on the door. But for now, she had no choice. She had to trust him, a stranger in a city that, by all accounts, despised her kind. A hush fell over them, broken only by the crackle of a small heating unit against the wall. Ethan caught himself staring at the child, marveling at her skin color, at those luminous eyes that held so much innocence. The baby flailed a tiny arm, stirring the blanket, revealing flecks of silver in her hair, silver that shimmered like stardust. Something deep within Ethan's chest clenched, an emotion he could not immediately name. He had lived alone for years. He had grown accustomed to solitude. But in that moment, cradling the quiet presence of two souls who needed shelter, he felt a spark of purpose rekindle, a forgotten sense of compassion that stirred him to act without hesitation. As the night wore on, Sira dozed fitfully on the couch, stirring at every groan of the wind, while Ethan prepared a corner of his small spare room, setting blankets on the cot and ensuring the heating unit could handle the plummeting temperature. He wondered if, come morning, he would regret this decision, but he found no strength in himself to turn them away. Dawn came, pale and cold, filtering through the frosted windows. The storm had passed, leaving a fresh blanket of snow that glittered under the timid sun. Ethan rose early, startled to find that he had fallen asleep in a chair by the fireplace. Memories of the previous night rushed back to him. For a moment, he feared it had all been a dream. But then he heard soft murmuring from the spare room. Sira was awake, tending to her infant. He stood, stretching stiff limbs, and walked over, tapping lightly on the half-open door. She turned, a guarded expression crossing her features. "Did you sleep well?" he asked gently, trying not to startle her. "Well enough," she replied. The child, eyes bright despite the early hour, made a small cooing sound. Ethan smiled. A fleeting moment of warmth passed between them, the small sort of connection that arises when two strangers find themselves caring for the same vulnerable life. Over a simple breakfast of rehydrated eggs and warm oatmeal, Ethan asked cautious questions, mindful not to pry. Syrah explained that the Valari outpost on the city's outskirts had once been a sanctuary for her people who had fled the ravages of a galactic war. The war had ended officially, but old hostilities and resentments lingered. The local authorities, funded by corporate interests, wanted the land for expansion. They used intimidation and legal loopholes to evict the Valari. Some had tried to fight, but the majority had scattered, fleeing to safe havens or leaving the planet altogether. Syrah had been on the run for weeks, staying in hidden corners, scrounging for food. She tried to find a place willing to accept an alien mother and her child, but the fear of harboring illegals left her turned away from every door. Without identification and official papers, she and her baby were targets for immediate deportation, or worse, capture by unscrupulous figures who saw profit in trafficking refugees. Eventually, she had ended up at Ethan's doorstep, driven to desperation by hunger and cold. He listened in grave silence, feeling a knot form in his stomach. The city he called home had grown cruel, fueled by prejudice and greed. Glancing at the baby, who was wrapped in a worn cloth, he felt anger burn within him that such an innocent life could be threatened by the selfishness of others. "You can stay here," he said finally, though the weight of those words pressed on him. "At least until you have a better plan. I'm not wealthy, but I can't turn you away." Her golden eyes shone with gratitude. For a heartbeat, she looked as though she might cry, but she swallowed the tears. "Thank you," she whispered. I know the risk you take. They punish those who help us. But I promise, we won't bring trouble. I'll leave once I find a safe route off-world." Ethan opened his mouth to protest, but paused. She was right. The city's enforcers were not gentle toward those who sheltered refugees, especially the Valari, who had become scapegoats for the city's economic woes. If the authorities discovered them, Ethan would be in danger, possibly imprisoned. Yet looking at Syrah and her child, he knew he had made his choice. They needed kindness, not condemnation. So began a quiet, precarious routine. Days passed in cautious normalcy. Syrah rarely ventured outside, not wanting to draw attention, while Ethan went about his usual errands. He lived on modest savings from a settlement he had received years ago, enough to keep him in his humble home, with some leftover for groceries. He stocked up on baby supplies, meager as they were, and Syrah did her best to help with chores, all the while keeping an eye on the windows, ears perked for trouble. The tension rose one afternoon, nearly 2 weeks after Syrah's arrival. Ethan was reading on the couch, while Syrah fed the baby in the kitchen, humming a soft Valari lullaby. Suddenly, there came a sharp rap on the door, the sound of heavy fists. Ethan's heart leapt into his throat. Syrah froze, color draining from her face. She hugged the baby protectively. Ethan set his book aside and stepped to the door, heart pounding as he peered through the small peephole. 2 men in long coats stood on the porch. One wore a broad hat, angled low over his eyes. The other was thickly built, with a face carved into stern lines. They had the look of hired muscle, or perhaps local enforcers. Uncertain, Ethan opened the door a crack, pressing his face against it. "Yes?" he said, struggling to keep his voice steady. "We're looking for a Valari woman," the tall man said, voice flat. "Seen her around these parts? She's on the run, traveling with a baby. Could be dangerous." Ethan feigned confusion. "An alien woman with a baby? No. I've been here alone for months." The thick-set man leaned closer. "We have a tip she was seen in this neighborhood. Maybe she came by. You sure you haven't heard anything?" Ethan forced a wry laugh. "Look, nobody knocks on my door, especially not an alien refugee. Check my place if you want, but it's just me inside." His stomach clenched as he spoke the lie. Syrah, hidden in the kitchen, must have been holding her breath. The men exchanged glances. One stepped forward, as if to test Ethan's invitation to search. But after a moment's hesitation, he seemed to decide that there was little point in rummaging through a poor man's tiny home, possibly out of laziness or disinterest. "Fine," the tall man said at last. "But keep an eye out. If you see anything, or hear anything, you'd better report it. We don't take kindly to harboring fugitives." With that, the men turned and trudged off into the snow. Ethan closed the door, letting out a shaky breath, leaning his forehead against the cold wood. His hands trembled. That had been too close. He pictured Syrah, cowering in the kitchen, half-starved not long ago, wholly dependent on his good graces. He walked into the kitchen. Syrah stood stock still, the baby stirring fitfully in her arms. Her eyes asked the question her lips could not. Were they gone? They left, he whispered. I told them I hadn't seen you. But they'll be back. I'm sure of it. Syrah's expression crumpled with sorrow and fear. I don't want you to be in danger, she murmured, tears gathering along the rims of her glowing eyes. I can't stay here. I'll find somewhere else, tonight. Ethan shook his head firmly. No, he said, stepping forward and placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. You won't make it on your own. I'm not going to let them scare me into leaving you out in the cold. But, he cut her off, voice low yet resolute. Listen to me. I can't just sit by and watch them hunt you down. You have a child, a beautiful, innocent life. If we do nothing, they'll take her away. We must figure out a plan, not just for tonight, but for the future. Syrah's lips parted, and she stared at Ethan as if seeing him for the first time. She did not speak, perhaps because she feared if she did, the tears she had held back would flow freely. Instead, she just nodded, gratitude and terror mingling in her gaze. Thus, over a trembling hush, they made a decision that would alter both their lives. They would flee the city. The plan formed haltingly. Through contacts Ethan had from years past, mostly old acquaintances who owed him favors, he discovered there was a transport ship leaving in 3 days, bound for the outer colonies. It was rumored that the frontier worlds, like Vera 3, allowed both humans and Valari to live side by side with minimal interference from the old authorities. If Syrah and her baby reached such a place, they might find a chance to rebuild, perhaps even find others of their people who had escaped. But getting out of the city was dangerous. Patrols prowled the main gates, scanning for unauthorized Valari. Checkpoints littered the roads, eyes always searching for those who dared to defy the new regulations. And for Syrah, it was even more perilous, with a vulnerable child who needed constant care. Ethan began gathering supplies, rations, warm clothing, a few documents that might be forged or altered to help them pass the gates. Each day, he returned from errands with a grim expression, hearing rumors of intensifying sweeps by the authorities, of increasing hostility toward refugees. Men like the ones who had knocked on his door thrived in this environment, ferreting out hidden aliens for profit or out of twisted civic duty. In those tense days, an unspoken bond grew between Ethan and Syrah. At night, when the city was quiet and no knocks threatened the door, they would talk. He told her about his younger years, about how he had once dreamed of traveling among the stars before family obligations anchored him to Everfall. He told her of the war from his perspective, how he had watched the news of battles in distant star systems, never imagining that one day survivors of that war would arrive at his doorstep. Syrah, in turn, shared fragments of Valari culture, how their people cherished music above all else, how they believed the cosmos was woven together in harmonic chords, and how each soul contributed to the great cosmic melody. She told him of her child's name, Lena, which in Valari meant dawn's gentle warmth. She spoke of the father, lost in the final days of conflict, leaving Syrah alone to protect their child, wandering through a galaxy that had grown cruel and unwelcoming. Ethan found himself strangely moved by these revelations, feeling a tenderness towards Syrah that both comforted and unsettled him. He reminded himself to remain pragmatic. This was a temporary arrangement. Once they reached the transport, she would leave, and he would remain behind to face whatever consequences might come. Yet, in the quiet hours, he could not help but imagine a life on the frontier, far from these crumbling streets, where differences mattered less and peace was more than a dream. But the time for idle imagining came to an end soon enough. Late on the second night of their planned escape, Ethan rose from a restless slumber to find Syrah awake, standing by the window, her breath fogging the glass. Moonlight illuminated her blue skin, giving her an ethereal glow. She cradled Lena in her arms, the child sleeping soundly. Outside, the snow swirled in silver drifts, and the distant hum of a patrol vehicle droned, reminding them that they were not free yet. "Can't sleep?" he asked softly, approaching. She shook her head. "I keep thinking about tomorrow," she murmured. "Running again? Hiding? What if something goes wrong?" Her voice caught in her throat. "I'm so tired of running." Gently, he placed a hand on her shoulder. "I know," he said, "but this is the only way." For a moment, they stood in silence, the hush of the night pressing in. Then he added, "If we can get on that ship, I'll do everything in my power to help you start anew." She turned to him, eyes shimmering in the moonlight. "You speak as if you're going to stay behind, but—" She hesitated. "I wish," she began, but her voice died away, lost to unspoken possibilities. Ethan's heart thudded. He realized, in that moment, how deeply he cared for them, how he dreaded the idea of letting them vanish from his life. But the question was, did he dare attempt to join them? This city was all he had ever known, even though it had become a place of shadows. The thought of leaving everything behind, forging a new path on an alien world among other refugees and outcasts, both thrilled and terrified him. "Let's see how tomorrow goes," he said quietly, sidestepping the confession tangled in his chest. Syrah nodded, turning her gaze once more to the moonlit streets. When morning arrived, it came with a biting wind that rattled the windows and a sky dull as lead. Ethan and Syrah hurried through final preparations. Lena, wrapped warmly in a patched blanket, seemed to sense the tension, fussing in her mother's arms. Ethan shouldered a small bag of supplies and carefully checked that the forged transit passes were tucked safely in his jacket. He had scraped together all his remaining funds to procure those documents, hoping they would at least get them past the city gates. They set out just after dawn. The plan was to slip through the lesser-used back alleys, avoiding main thoroughfares where patrols scanned for suspicious activity. The snow had accumulated in drifts, forcing them to wade through ankle-deep powder. The wind pelted them with icy needles. Yet they pressed on, forging a path through the labyrinth of abandoned buildings and crumbling walls. Everfall was a city of ghosts that morning. Few dared to venture out in the bitter cold, and that worked to their advantage, making it easier to travel undetected. They kept close to the outskirts, hugging the sides of buildings, pausing whenever they spotted movement in the distance. At times, a patrol drone buzzed overhead, its mechanical eye sweeping over the deserted streets, but they ducked beneath awnings or hidden alcoves until it passed. The tension was suffocating, each minute a test of courage. As they neared the old industrial sector, an uneasy hush fell. This was the most dangerous stretch of their route, for it lay close to a major checkpoint that led to the outer roads. The plan was not to cross at the main checkpoint, where scanning technology would certainly detect Syrah's alien biology, but to skirt around it through a half-collapsed tunnel rumored to remain partially unmonitored. Ethan led the way, recalling the instructions gleaned from his old contact. His breath came in ragged puffs, merging with the swirling snow. He glanced back at Syrah, who clutched Lena to her chest. The child had grown quieter, wide golden eyes staring out from the blanket, as though perplexed by this relentless journey. They arrived at a derelict concrete structure, partially caved in, with twisted metal beams protruding like broken bones. Beyond it lay the tunnel, half filled with debris. Ethan knelt, tossing aside chunks of shattered masonry to clear a path. "We crawl through here," he murmured, wiping sweat from his brow. "Stay close behind me. It should lead us near the outer roads." Syrah nodded, her face set with grim determination. With the baby secured against her body, she followed Ethan into the darkness, each movement causing echoes to ricochet through the tight space. Dust and stale air assaulted their lungs, and the gloom was lit only by the faint glow of Syrah's eyes and the flicker of a battered flashlight Ethan carried. The iron tang of rust permeated everything. About halfway through, Ethan heard voices above them. Fear seized him. He motioned for Syrah to freeze. Through cracks in the tunnel ceiling, fragments of light seeped in, revealing silhouettes of men standing just outside. "I'm telling you, the tips said they might come this way," a voice growled. "Search every inch." Ethan's heart hammered. He recognized the voices from the men who had visited his house, searching for Syrah. He exchanged a worried glance with her. They had to remain absolutely still. Any sound would give them away. The infant stirred, letting out a soft whimper, and panic jolted through Syrah. She pressed a gentle hand over Lena's mouth, muffling the cry. Above, the men's voices faded in and out. It seemed they were circling the perimeter of the collapsed structure, not yet certain anyone was hidden beneath. For agonizing minutes, Ethan and Syrah remained motionless, lungs burning, hearts pounding. Dust clung to their faces. The tunnel felt like a tomb. Finally, the crunch of boots on snow receded. A new hush settled. Exchanging silent nods, they continued, painstakingly slow, until at last they emerged on the far side. Beyond the wreckage, the road stretched away from the city gates, leading into the frosted wilderness. A battered fence with gaping holes marked the city's boundary. If they crossed it, they would be on the open road, where the transport hub was located about a mile away. Victory felt close, but they could not celebrate yet. With cautious steps, they approached the fence, scanning for watchers. None appeared, so they slipped through a jagged tear in the chain links, the metal scraping Ethan's coat. Then they were through, heartbeats drumming wildly. A sense of liberation fluttered in their chests, but still they moved swiftly, for the ship's departure time drew near. The final stretch to the transport hub was a lonely, desolate road half buried by snow. Rows of broken streetlights loomed overhead, leaning precariously like silent sentinels. The hub itself consisted of a small station set at the base of a large platform, with a slender tower that housed control staff. A single transport shuttle was visible on the pad, its hull a dull gray, engines idle, steam curling from exhaust vents. Ethan swallowed hard, adrenaline spiking. The checkpoint aboard that shuttle was minimal, rumored to be run by a private operator who asked few questions. But it was also expensive. He patted the pockets of his coat, feeling the small stash of credits he had saved. Would it be enough for 2 adult tickets and an infant? Possibly not. Yet he had come this far. He would not fail now. They hurried across the deserted lot, wind biting at exposed skin. A single guard stood by the station entrance, hunched in a heavy coat. He barely glanced at them as they approached, his attention on a handheld device that glowed dully. Ethan's forged passes, combined with the bribe money he had prepared, might get them through. Tickets, the guard muttered, looking up with a bored expression. Ethan offered the passes, sliding a small credit chip across as well. The guard's eyes flicked from the passes to the chip, arching a brow. Then he shrugged, pocketing the bribe without much comment. "Go on in," he said, waving them through. A rush of relief made Ethan's legs feel weak. He glanced at Sierra, who blinked, uncertain, but hopeful. Inside the station, the air was slightly warmer, though still chilly. Several vacant seats lined the walls, but only a few travelers were about. A couple of rough-looking miners, a trader pacing restlessly, and a mother with 2 small children. No one paid Sierra and Ethan any mind, which was precisely what they wanted. They approached a bored clerk behind a thick glass panel. "We need 3 tickets to Vera 3, Ethan said in a hushed tone. 1 adult human, 1 Valari adult, 1 infant. The clerk, a wiry man with graying hair, raised a brow. "Valari," he repeated, eyes lingering on Sierra. She shifted, cradling Lena protectively. Ethan forced a casual tone. "That's right. Is that a problem?" A quiet moment passed. Then the clerk shook his head, tapping at a terminal. "Couldn't care less," he said, "long as you have the credits." Ethan slid over the sum. It was hefty, nearly everything he had. The clerk counted it, turned to rummage through a drawer, and finally handed back 3 tickets printed on flimsy plastic cards. "Boarding in 10 minutes, he said, jerking his thumb at a door that led to the platform outside. "Don't miss it." Ethan exhaled slowly, feeling the trembling in his hands. They had done it. Almost. Now they only needed to step onto that shuttle, and Sierra's nightmare of evasion might be over. Sierra looked at the tickets as though they were holy relics, tears gathering at the corners of her luminous eyes. They lingered in the waiting area. The other passengers gathered their belongings when an automated voice announced boarding. A hiss of hydraulics indicated the shuttle's doors opening. Sierra rose, still hugging Lena. But Ethan didn't move immediately. A swirl of conflicting emotions churned inside him. She turned, realizing he hadn't followed. "Ethan," she said softly. Are you not coming?" He swallowed hard, the cacophony of his thoughts drowning out everything else. This was his chance to leave Everfall, to escape the oppression he despised, to start anew, perhaps even remain close to Sierra and Lena. But the weight of the unknown loomed massive. He had no guarantee of finding work, no idea how to survive on Vera 3. The life he had, as lonely and miserable as it sometimes was, existed here. But he looked at Sierra, at the lines of worry on her face, at the hopeful glimmer in her eyes that he might stay with them, that he might help raise this child who had grown to trust him. He realized that the only real future worth having was walking out that door toward the shuttle. "Wait," he said, voice tight. He fished out his wallet, rummaging through. He had spent most of his credits. Only a small emergency stash remained, tucked behind a photograph of his parents. His gaze flicked to the photograph, a pang of nostalgia hitting him. Then he slid out the last of the credits, just enough to cover another ticket, if needed, or to bribe someone else, should an emergency arise. "There's nothing left for me here," he whispered. The words emerged with an unexpected clarity, as though he had made this realization in a single, decisive moment. "I'm coming with you, if you'll have me." Syrah's face softened, relief and joy flashing across her features. She nodded, unable to fully smile for fear of tears. "We would be honored," she murmured. "Lena needs you, Ethan. I need you." His breath caught, and he felt a surge of emotion so potent it nearly brought tears to his eyes. He nodded, stepping to her side. Together, they approached the doors leading to the shuttle. The ramp lowered with a metallic groan, lights illuminating the vessel's interior. One by one, passengers filed on. The final steps felt surreal, each footfall echoing the end of one life and the start of another. As they reached the top of the ramp, a wave of warmth and pressurized air greeted them. Inside, rows of worn seats stretched along the shuttle's narrow cabin. They found seats near the back, buckled themselves in, and cradled Lena between them. The child, sensing the atmosphere, gazed around with wide golden eyes. A short time later, the shuttle doors sealed shut. Engines whirred, thrusters vibrating the floor beneath their feet. Outside, the station receded, and with a shuddering lurch, the craft lifted, breaking free from the planet's surface. Through the small portholes, Ethan caught a final glimpse of Everfall, cloaked in swirling snow, growing smaller by the second as they ascended into the dusky sky. He closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the world slip off his shoulders. And beside him, Syrah let out a trembling exhale, leaning her head against his shoulder. They had done it. They were free. A sunlit sky stretched overhead, the color of polished turquoise. Beneath it, lush emerald forests swayed in a gentle breeze, and glimmering rivers wound their way through rolling hills. Vera 3 was a world known for its mild climate and vibrant biodiversity, a stark contrast to the harsh, snowy environment Ethan and Syrah had left behind. They stood on a modest plot of land near the outskirts of a growing settlement, the hum of hovercrafts passing occasionally in the distance. Wooden structures dotted the area, built by human and Volari settlers alike who had come here for a fresh start, forging a quiet community free from the prejudices that once shackled them. The settlement was a tapestry of languages, skin tones, and species, a small beacon of hope in a galaxy often riddled with division. Ethan leaned against a low wooden fence, surveying the half-constructed home that he and Syrah were building with the help of newfound friends. Sweat beaded on his brow, but a satisfied smile tugged at his lips. No longer bound by the gloom of Everfall, he had thrown himself into manual labor, discovering a sense of accomplishment with each board nailed into place. Behind him, Syrah approached, her attire simple yet practical, her once gaunt cheeks now fuller with health. She carried Lena in a cloth sling. The baby, now plumper and bright-eyed, let out an inquisitive chirp whenever she saw something new, be it a fluttering insect or a passing neighbor. "It's coming along nicely," Syrah said, glancing up at the wooden framework. "We'll have a roof over our heads soon enough." Ethan nodded, resting the hammer on a nearby railing. "It feels good, building something with my own hands," he replied, his gaze drifting to the horizon, where the settlement's bustling center shimmered. "It's strange, though, to think how quickly our lives changed." Syrah slipped an arm around him, resting her head on his shoulder. "We're fortunate," she said softly. "And you made this possible. If it weren't for you, Lena and I would." She broke off, her voice catching at the memory of those desperate nights. "We're together now. That is all that matters." He turned, pressing a gentle kiss to her temple. "I'm just thankful we found a place that welcomes us." On Vera 3, the local governing council had established clear policies ensuring basic rights for all species. While not every corner of the colony was free from prejudice, enough open-minded settlers inhabited this world that Volari like Syrah could walk openly, without fear of immediate persecution. Some humans still eyed the Volari warily, but the climate was far better than the oppressive rule of Everfall. Over time, Ethan and Sierra integrated into the life of the settlement. He found work as a repairman, his practical skills honed from years of fixing up his old home. Word spread quickly of his reliability, and soon neighbors called on him to repair everything from broken water purifiers to malfunctioning hover bikes. Sierra, with her delicate knowledge of Volari herbology and her gentle manner, began tending to a garden of exotic plants and assisting a local medic who had grown curious about Volari healing traditions. Lena became a beloved fixture of their small community. Neighbors marveled at her luminous eyes and cooing giggles. The child grew stronger with each passing day, toddling around the small yard, chasing after bright-winged insects that hovered among the flowers. The nightmares of the city, the specter of men pounding on the door, gradually receded, replaced by the gentle cadence of a new life. Yet, now and then, word would arrive of fresh crackdowns in other sectors of the galaxy, or rumors of new mercenaries hunting refugee Volari. Whenever such news came, Sierra would stiffen, fear flashing across her features. Ethan would reassure her, reminding her that Vera 3 was far removed from the chaos, protected by local laws and distant from the watchful eye of the more oppressive regimes. Still, the scars of their flight remained, leaving them both vigilant, never wanting to let their guard down entirely. Days melted into weeks, and the skeleton of their new home was fleshed out with walls, a roof, and windows to let in the golden daylight of this tranquil planet. They worked side by side, sometimes in companionable silence, sometimes with laughter and conversation. The bond they forged in their shared struggle deepened, evolving into a quiet but profound love. One evening, as the sky blazed with a lavender sunset, Ethan returned from a repair job at a nearby farmstead to find Sierra in a joyous mood. She was teaching Lena a simple Volari melody, singing softly in that otherworldly language Ethan found enchanting. The toddler, perched on a cushion, clapped her small hands, attempting to mimic the tune in bursts of giggles. "You're home," Sierra greeted him with a glowing smile. Ethan let out a content sigh, leaning his hammer against the wall. "And I've never been more glad to see you too," he replied. He crossed the room, scooped Lena into his arms, and tickled her belly, eliciting peals of laughter. "Your mother's teaching you music, he teased. "I'll bet you'll be a star performer someday." Sierra's gaze shone with pride. She has an ear for harmony, just like her father did. Volari children often learn songs before they learn to speak in full sentences. The mention of Lena's biological father was not a cause for discomfort. Over the months, Sierra had shared the story of the brave Volari soldier who had been lost in the final days of their people's retreat. She carried the memory with sorrow, yet also with acceptance, and she had told Ethan more than once that Lena's father would be at peace knowing she was safe and happy here. They dined on a simple meal of steamed vegetables and grilled fish, flavored with local herbs that Sierra had grown, the meal more satisfying than any Ethan could remember in his old life. As they ate, they discussed the next steps for finalizing their home, new seeds they wanted to plant, and the possibility of adopting an orphan Volari child from a neighboring settlement who had lost her parents during the war. The thought of further expanding their unconventional family warmed Ethan's heart, though he felt a stab of uncertainty, wondering if they had the means. Still, the mere possibility showed how far they had come. From two desperate refugees and a solitary human with an aching soul, they had grown into something resembling a family, a unit bound by love rather than blood. After dinner, with Lena fast asleep in her small bed, Ethan and Sierra sat on the porch, the night air mild and perfumed by blossoms. Stars dotted the sky in a vast tapestry. She leaned against him, and he wrapped an arm around her shoulders, listening to the gentle rhythm of her breathing. "I never imagined this," she whispered after a while, voice tinged with wonder. "In my darkest moments, back in that frozen city, I thought all hope was lost, that no one would ever take us in, that we were destined to keep running until we couldn't run anymore." Ethan squeezed her shoulder gently. "Maybe that's why it's all the sweeter now," he said, gazing up at the stars that had once seemed so far out of reach. "Because we dared to hope, even when it seemed impossible." Sierra turned her face up, golden eyes bright in the starlight. "I'm grateful for your kindness, Ethan Cole. Without you, I'd never have known there was a place where we could find peace." He inclined his head, a soft smile curving his lips. "Without you, I might never have left that lonely house, never found a reason to live again. So I guess we saved each other." Their hands entwined, and they sat in a comfortable silence, letting the soft chirping of night insects lull them. In the distance, the settlement's lights twinkled, and faint laughter or conversation drifted on the air, a peaceful community forging new bonds in the wake of galactic strife. Eventually, the silver moon rose high, and they retired to the modest bedroom that had once been a half-finished space. Now it was a cozy retreat, decorated with little touches of Valari culture and human keepsakes. A small carved instrument hung on one wall, and on another, a photograph of Ethan's parents, smiling in younger days. Beneath it was a simple tapestry Syrah had woven, depicting a Valari starship sailing among swirling nebulae. "Good night," Syrah whispered, settling beside Ethan. The warmth of her presence, and the soft breathing of their child in the next room, reminded him of how far they had journeyed from the fear and cold. "Good night," he murmured, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Sleep well." And sleep they did, wrapped in a happiness neither had ever truly expected to find. The morning sun bathed the valley in gold. Bird-like creatures with iridescent plumage trilled from the treetops, greeting the dawn. Outside the newly completed home, Ethan and Syrah worked in the fresh air, laying the final stones for a small walkway. Lena toddled nearby, chasing a shimmering insect that danced just out of reach. In the distance, the settlement's marketplace bustled with activity. Humans, Valari, and a smattering of other species mingling amid stalls brimming with produce, textiles, and crafts. Occasionally, ships soared overhead, arriving from or departing to other planets. Once in a while, a new refugee family would disembark, eyes wide with hope, seeking a chance at a fresh start. Vera 3 had become something of a refuge for the displaced. Ethan, pausing to wipe sweat from his brow, gazed at the rolling hills, the forests of broad-leafed trees, the gentle sparkle of the far-off river. He inhaled deeply, tasting freedom and possibility in every breath. It was a world away from the cramped kitchen where he had once stood alone, half dead from loneliness, waiting for a meal to finish heating. He recalled the night a frightened Valari mother had knocked at his door, how that single moment had cracked open his world and allowed compassion to take root. Syrah glanced at him, noticing the thoughtful expression on his face. "What are you thinking?" she asked softly, pressing the final stone into place. He smiled, coming over to brush the dust from her hands. "Just remembering that night we first met," he said. "How different everything was. How we were both so uncertain, so afraid." She nodded, her golden eyes soft with memory. "It feels like a lifetime ago," she admitted. "Yet I can still feel the cold, the hunger, the terror of being turned away at every door." She paused, then gazed at Lena, who squealed with delight as she finally caught hold of the glittering insect, only to let it go a moment later. "But now, that terror is behind us. We have a home." Ethan slipped an arm around her waist, pulling her gently to him. "We have each other," he said. "And no matter what the galaxy throws at us, we'll face it together." He pressed his forehead against hers, a gesture that felt both intimate and comforting. She closed her eyes, smiling. The warmth of the sun, the promise of a new day, the laughter of their child, all wove together into a tapestry of contentment. Lena toddled over, eyes bright, babbling a mixture of Valari syllables and the human words she was learning. She held up her tiny hands, wanting to be lifted. Ethan picked her up and spun her around, her giggles ringing out like bell chimes. Syrah watched them with a radiant smile, a portrait of maternal joy. In that moment, the hardships of Everfall seemed distant, the sorrow of war a dim echo. Though they knew the galaxy was far from perfect, and that countless refugees still wandered in search of safety, they also knew that hope could blossom in unexpected places. Every day, new friendships were forged, new beginnings took shape. Vera 3, with its emerald hills and radiant skies, was proof that life could be reborn from the ashes of conflict. Ethan set Lena down, and the toddler clapped her hands, toddling off to investigate a patch of wildflowers. He and Syrah returned to their task, smoothing the walkway stones until it formed a neat path leading to the door of their home. A gentle breeze caressed them, carrying the scent of blooming flora and distant water. A neighbor called out in greeting, passing on a hoverbike with a load of fresh produce. Sierra waved back cheerfully, while Ethan offered a friendly nod. Even now, months into their life here, he sometimes marveled at the acceptance and generosity shown by the settlement. Yes, tensions arose now and then, but the spirit of cooperation endured. Humans helped Valari adapt to the new environment, and Valari enriched human culture with art, music, and a perspective shaped by traveling the stars. Together, they cultivated a shared dream of peace. When the walkway was complete, Sierra stood up, surveying their handiwork. "It's good," she said, sounding content. "A place for guests to arrive, welcomed by warmth, not turned away into the cold." Ethan placed his hand over hers. "That's how it should be," he replied, remembering those fateful knocks at his door. "No one deserves to be left outside in the freezing night." Sierra inclined her head in agreement, and for a moment, silence stretched between them, filled only by the natural symphony of Vera 3's wilderness. Then Lena, deciding she had explored enough, returned to their side. She tugged at Ethan's pant leg, babbling insistently, demanding attention. "Someone wants to show us something," Sierra said, smiling. Lena pointed a tiny finger at the flowers, chattering gleefully. Sierra bent down, picking one of the blossoms, a pastel bloom with iridescent speckles, and tucked it behind the toddler's ear. The child grinned, her golden eyes shining with delight. "We should plant more flowers around the house," Sierra mused. "A garden for Lena to play in. Perhaps I can bring some Valari species, too. Mix them with the local varieties." "That sounds wonderful," Ethan said. "And maybe we can build a small greenhouse for the more delicate plants, so they thrive all year round." They chatted easily about these plans, about the future they were shaping with each passing day. The shadows of old fears were gone, replaced by the simple, radiant contentment of building a life together. If once Sierra had been a desperate mother, forced to abandon hope, and if once Ethan had been a solitary man, burdened by regrets, now they had emerged into a new chapter where each sunrise promised wonder and growth. Eventually, a gentle chime from the settlement's main square signaled midday, reminding Ethan of a neighbor who had asked for help repairing a malfunctioning generator. "Duty calls," he said with a grin, picking up his hammer and tool belt. Sierra teased him with a playful smile. "Go on then. Don't keep them waiting. We'll be here when you come back." He paused, gazing at her and Lena, allowing himself a moment to simply feel the warmth that bloomed in his chest. "I'll see you soon," he murmured, leaning in to plant a soft kiss on Sierra's lips. "I love you." She blushed faintly, happiness lighting her features. "I love you too," she whispered, and the words were still new enough to fill them both with a tender glow. He turned, heading down the freshly laid path, stepping onto the sunlit road. As he glanced back, he saw Sierra gently rocking Lena, pointing out the small wonders of the yard. The child laughed, reaching for her mother's hand, safe in the knowledge that she was cherished. And Ethan knew, with a certainty that quelled every lingering doubt, that they had found something precious, not merely survival, but a home where they could truly live. And so ended the journey that began with a desperate mother at a lonely man's door, a journey once fraught with terror and flight, now blossoming into promise and joy. They had forged a new family, binding two worlds in love and hope. And in the gentle light of Vera 3's morning, they stood as testimony that kindness was never truly lost, that compassion could bloom even in the harshest season, and that sometimes, in the darkest hours, opening one's door could open one's heart to a future more beautiful than ever imagined.